Speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I've been promising myself for the last 3 months that I would give you at least one sermon on the Moses story, because we've been reading that Moses story for quite a while in the lectionary these last couple of months, and it is so full of critical information about our tradition, our faith, and in fact our spiritual journey that I can't ignore it. And yet I've had one thing after another that has sort of trumped that story. So today you're getting the whole thing. So I'm doing the entire story of Moses this morning. I will get to Massa and Meribah, which is our story today in the lectionary. But first I have to give you the sketch of the whole picture. Some of you this is review, but it is important enough that it's worth returning to from time to time. The critical thing about the story of Moses, the story of the Israelites in the wilderness, is that it is the central story of the Jewish faith. It is the beginning of Israel as a nation and under God. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are the prehistory. The real story, the real creation story of Israel is the journey through the wilderness of the Israelites. And that is what they look back to as their founding document. And indeed, it has been retold for thousands of years because it is understood by both the Jews and the Christians, and now the Muslims and possibly others, as a message from God about spiritual truths. Namely, what a journey with the Lord looks like. It is a roadmap to the spiritual journey. And to understand it symbolically in those terms, the whole story opens up. It becomes your story and my story. So that's the sketch that I'm going to try to draw for you this morning. It begins with the burning bush. Actually, no, it begins before the burning bush. It begins in slavery in Egypt. And that's what you have to start by understanding. The whole problem that the story addresses is the problem of slavery in Egypt. You need to understand that Egyptian slavery was comfortable. It was slavery in the greatest nation on earth of its day. They had the most advanced technology, the highest civilization, the greatest culture, etc., etc., etc. And yet the Israelites were slaves there. So they were not free, they were oppressed, but they were oppressed in a way that they could live with. They were comfortable with the whole thing. And then we have the burning bush. The burning bush was God's appearance to Moses and through Moses to Israel, where the fundamental message of the burning bush was wake up and I've got a plan to free you. You're in slavery and this needs to change. So Moses says, okay. He doesn't say okay right away. He says why me and all that kind of stuff. But eventually Moses agrees to the program and becomes God's agent of change to release Israel from slavery in Egypt. And so you have the plagues, and you have tumults and portents in the heavens, and finally the parting of the Red Sea and the escape of the slaves and the destruction of Pharaoh's chariot. So far this should be familiar to you. Now, overlay on that story the personal story of faith of any given person. It starts in comfortable slavery. It starts in slavery, but in the most advanced civilization on the planet. And so the parallels are just entirely too easy for the preacher to draw to modern-day North America and ancient Egypt. I will let you fill in the blanks yourself. This is a sketch, after all. We start in our culture as comfortable slaves. And we are slaves. We are told we are in a land of freedom. And what that freedom means is we are free to buy anything that we can afford. That's the freedom we have. And in that ostensible freedom, we are, all of us, enslaved to our appetites, to our whims, to our addictions, whatever they may be. And so we find ourselves back in the situation where we started, where we don't have an oppressive totalitarian government that is oppressing us. What we have is the oppression of the wrong kind of freedom. The freedom not to be told what to do, which lets us become subject to the tyranny of our own desires, our own fears, our own baggage, our own history. And so most of us in this culture live our lives out under that kind of slavery, where we are not considered in our lives, we are reactive. We get triggered, we get hit with an experience that triggers a response, and we do that, and it makes our life worse. We don't know why we do the things we do, and yet we do them, and we find ourselves in these patterns. The fundamental pattern that I would argue all North Americans, in fact humanity, who are wired this way, find ourselves in, is the pattern of addiction. We are all junkies. Not all of us are junkies to weed, or to cocaine, or whatever the obvious one, to alcohol, right? Some of us are junkies to alcohol and cocaine and weed, but all of us are junkies to something. And for most of us, it's more subtle. It is what people think of me. I couldn't possibly live without my reputation, right? For some people, it's the fact that people appreciate everything I do for them. And so I need to be loved, I need to be needed. And so my entire life is structured around making sure that other people give me the feedback that I am such a loving and giving person. And I become a slave to that pattern, and my entire life is organized around that principle. And it's a comfortable place because it feeds my needs. I need to be needed, I get what I want this way, and yet at the same time, it's a form of slavery. We are not the person that we were called to be, and there's some part of us that knows that we don't like the end results of these patterns. And so whatever the pattern is, whatever the subtle thing is that is our happy place, our drug of choice, that's the thing that is the thing that enslaves us, and from which the spiritual journey promises to free us, to become the person we were meant to be, free of our addictions and our enslavements, to really be free, to follow what God intended for each one of us to be. And so for those of us on the spiritual journey, we have had some kind of burning bush moment. We've had an experience of God's presence where we've said, there's got to be more to life than this. There's got to be some way to get on that journey and discover what I'm meant to be, discover that beauty and being and bliss that I intuit is in front of my nose, if only I could just see it. And so we start on the journey. And usually starting on the journey either happens because of or precipitates some kind of calamity or crisis in our lives. Sometimes it's the crisis that drives us out of the slavery, that everything is going along fine with our habits and our addictions and our predilections until something hits us like a truck. And it's a death in the family, or it's a relationship breakdown, or it's some kind of other crash, a relationship crash, or a work crash, or just a sense where you just have no interest in getting out of bed in the morning. That these crashes become the plagues, the calamities that are part of the thing that stirs us out of our complacency and gets us on the journey. And then, of course, there is the sabotage of the spiritual journey. When we really want to make changes, there will be people and situations that sabotage the change. And so you have the armies of Pharaoh that come to recapture or kill the Israelites and put them back in slavery where they belong. And yet, if we are on the journey, if we have determined to follow God and follow God's leading, then at some point we will go through the Red Sea, where that at some point there will be a change in our life where we can't go back. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't go back to the way we were. We've left that slavery. We are now free of that slavery. And here's the bad news. As soon as we hit that point, we realize that the place we came to is not the promised land. No one on the spiritual journey gets out of their own slavery and instantly becomes the child of God they were meant to be. In fact, they enter what is universally understood to be a wilderness journey. And the wilderness journey is 40 years long. And remember, 40 is code for childbirth. 40 weeks of childbirth, 40 years of wilderness means something new is being born. And what is being born is the new Israel. The old Israel has to die. The new Israel has to be born. And today's reading is the turning point where God says, I am not bringing you to the promised land right away. You are doomed to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because you grumbled against me. That's the reading today. And there's a cultural difference between myself and the ancient Israelites. And I got an insight into that when I heard a story of a seduction attempt that my friend was on a trip, and this gorgeous Latina woman decided to seduce him. And I didn't understand. So he told me this story, and she was very forward and saying, no one will ever know, and my apartment's right over here, and all the rest of it. And he managed to say no, but his friend was dating her friend, and when that relationship broke up, the Latina's friend exploded in rage and burnt articles of clothing and so forth. And this was considered normal and appropriate in that kind of Latina culture, that if you spurn the woman, then you will get the explosion, and as it should be. And so in my conversation with my friend about the seduction attempt, I said, well, it's morally good that you said no, but you also dodged a bullet on that one. Because if you had said yes, you don't know what you were getting into with that kind of woman, that kind of culture. And I think that's how we need to read God in the story of ancient Israel. It is a passionate culture. And of course, God expresses God's self through this passionate response. I did all this for you. I sent plagues. I sent the parting of the Red Sea. I gave you Moses. I did signs, miracles, wonders. The only reason you're alive and free is because I did this for you. And you have the audacity to complain to me? Do you not trust me? This is the plan. This is the process. And you're in the wilderness and you're saying, oh, we'd like to get her to Egypt. And so in today's story, God erupts like a Latina woman and says, that's it. 40 years for you. All of you are dead. New people are the ones that are going to get the promised land, right? Now, I'm a Brit of a British extraction. I don't get that. In my version of the story, God goes, well, we're going to have to go to plan B. Just understated, but you're still going to get the 4 years of the wilderness with the Brit. They're just going to fight on it, right? So either way, the point of today's marker in the story is they're on the journey. They've gone past the point of no return. They are now absolutely on the faith journey. They are following the Lord, and they've realized they don't like it. It's hard. It's hard. Why does it have to be this hard? We don't like it. At least in Egypt, we had food, right? At least back in our slavery, we got to have our happy place. When I was a drunk, at least when I was on the bottle, I was happy for a moment. Now I'm just facing all of my problems, and I don't even have an escape anymore. I gave up the bottle for this, right? That's the point of today's story, right? And so if I weren't trying to sketch the whole thing and we're just focusing on today's story for the sermon, I would expand upon the point that it's okay to be a grumbler in the wilderness. There are lots more people just like you. If you're in the wilderness and grumbling, that's totally normal. Everybody does it. Everybody goes on the journey. Everybody finds themselves in the wilderness and not in the promised land, and everybody starts complaining. And that's okay. It just means that you're on the journey just like the Israelites. And the good news is that the challenge for you at that point in your life, if that's where you are spiritually, the challenge is to learn to trust. Learn to trust that this is a holy journey and that this too is part of the process. For me, I'm starting to say that I'm learning how to be grateful even for the calamities, because I discover things in calamities, and there's the possibility of change for my heart in adversity that is not possible when things are going well. And so even in my struggles and my hurts and my pains and my adversities, then there is grace and there is transformation, which could not be achieved any other way. And so at some level, I'm learning ever so slightly. Mostly I'm still mad about it, but ever so slightly I'm starting to see that there's a place for gratitude even in those moments when I go, yeah, I'm doing my best here, and this is what I get for it. And then, of course, as the journey goes, you have the giving of the law. Part of the wilderness journey is you need instruction. You need a way, you need a plan to stop being the old person and start being the new person. And so the giving of the Ten Commandments is the symbolic point of discipling, of putting yourself in the new school of being to become the new person, to become the person born in the wilderness that is finally ready to inherit the promised land. And so that is where all of us, most of us, but virtually all of us, spend the bulk of our spiritual lives, is in the wilderness. We are pilgrims through the wilderness journey where we don't necessarily get to the promised land at any time before we die. We have glimpses of it. We experience pieces of it. We get manna given to us in our journey, just enough for what we need to know that we're still on that journey. And we are disciples. We follow the instruction of the new way of being, which is given to us in our case through the example of Jesus. Because in our case as Christians, even though we retain the story of Moses and learn from him, and in fact understand Jesus' story through the lens of the Moses story, our leader is not Moses but Jesus. And it's the same story. It's the death of the old person so that the new person can rise again. And so the picking up your cross and following Jesus is the Christian version of following the pillar of fire and cloud through the wilderness. It's the same story. It's the same journey, the same spiritual journey, the same journey of transformation. And that's the journey we're all on. That's the purpose of the church, as far as I'm concerned. The purpose of the church isn't to fix the world like it wants to be fixed, which it doesn't. The purpose of the church is to remember this map to the spiritual journey, to support each other in that journey, and to have people that say, when you're in the wilderness, it's a dangerous place, we need to stick together, we need to continue to encourage each other, and we need, above all, to remind ourselves to trust that God is the author of this journey from beginning to end. And even though we don't know where we're going, and we feel like it doesn't have an end in sight, we trust that initial impetus that got us rolling, the burning bush in the first place, was true. It was a true insight into God's purpose for us, and we are continuing to follow where God leads. And in the end, we trust that the promised land waits for us. For most of us, it's going to be sometime after we're dead. Sorry to break it to you. But that's just true. I don't know anyone who says, oh yeah, I'm done with the spiritual journey. I'm perfect now. Nobody's there. So the promised land in its fullness is always a little step ahead of us. In Christian language, the end times, the end days are both now and not yet. We experience them partially now, but the fullness always waits ahead of us at some level. That's just the place in which we live. And in the meantime, we have to learn to continue to be students of what we are taught and to trust that this journey is a holy one. And sometimes, out of the corner of our eye, we glimpse that we have become